I think that we need to actually go to one of the original go-to definitions of fascism. Okay? I think we need to go back to one of the original definitions of fascism. Which is, of course, Umberto Eco's Ur-Fascism essay. Now, this was written in 1995, and it is written by someone who survived, I believe, yes, survived Mussolini's Italy. Okay? And Umberto Eco's 14 points has been an enduring method of actually pinning down just what fascism is, because it's a slippery ideology. It's a reactionary ideology, okay? It is an ideology of hatred and death. And it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what it is, because it manifests a little bit differently in every state that has implemented a fascist regime, okay? So we're going to take a look at the 14 points of Umberto Eco's fascism definition. And in order to do that, I'm going to read to you now the entire essay, Ur-Fascism. Because I know that even though I say you should go read the essay, a lot of you aren't going to do that. And I actually think it's really important that you guys, when you're asked what fascism is, actually have an answer. And don't just go, like, hand-waving away at, like, the conditions of Mussolini's Italy. Okay? So I'm going to read it to you. We're going to do a story time. All right? Here we go. I'm going to drink some energy juice first. All right. Ur-Fascism by Umberto Eco. It's a short essay, guys, relatively. Also, you can read it for free online. I'll post the link in chat for the full thing. Here you go. Here you go. Here you go. There we go. Now you all have it. In 1942, at the age of 10, I received the first provincial award of Ludi Juveniles, a voluntary compulsory competition for young Italian fascists, that is, for every young Italian. I elaborated with rhetorical skill on the subject, should we die for the glory of Mussolini and the immortal destiny of Italy? My answer was positive. I was a smart boy. I spent 2 of my early years among the SS, fascists, Republicans, and partisans shooting at one another, and I learned how to dodge bullets. It was good exercise. In April 1945, the partisans took over in Milan. 2 days later, they arrived in the small town where I was living at the time. It was a moment of joy. The main square was crowded with people singing and waving flags, calling in loud voices for Mimo, the partisan leader of that area. A former maresciallo of the Carabinieri, I'm going to be butchering some of these Italian terms, I'm sorry. Mimo joined the supporters of the General Badoglio, Mussolini's successor, and lost a leg during one of the first clashes with Mussolini's remaining forces. Mimo showed up on the balcony of the city hall, pale, leaning on his crutch, and with one hand tried to calm the crowd. I was waiting for his speech because my whole childhood had been marked by the great historic speeches of Mussolini, whose most significant passages we memorized in school. Silence. Mimo spoke in a hoarse voice, barely audible, and he said, "Citizens, friends, after so many painful sacrifices, here we are. Glory to those who have fallen for freedom." And that was it. He went back inside. The crowd yelled, the partisans raised their guns and fired festive volleys. We kids hurried to pick up the shells, precious items. But I had also learned that freedom of speech means freedom from rhetoric. A few days later, I saw the first American soldiers. They were African Americans. The first Yankee I met was a black man, Joseph, who introduced me to the marvels of Dick Tracy and Lil Abner. His comic books were brightly colored and smelled good. One of the officers, Major or Captain Muddy, was a guest in the villa of a family whose 2 daughters were my schoolmates. I met him in their garden where some ladies, surrounded by Captain Muddy, talked in tentative French. Captain Muddy knew some French too. My first image of American liberators was thus. After so many pale faces in black shirts, that of a cultivated black man in a yellow-green uniform saying, "Oui, merci beaucoup. Madame, voici jamais la champagne." Unfortunately, there was no champagne, but Captain Muddy gave me my first piece of Wrigley's spearmint, and I started chewing all day long. At night, I put my wad in a water glass so it would be fresh for the next day. In May, we heard that the war was over. Peace gave me a curious sensation. I'd been told that permanent warfare was the normal condition for a young Italian. In the following months, I discovered that the resistance was not only a local phenomenon, but a European one. I learned new exciting words like Rousseau, Marquis, Armée secrète, Rote Kapelle, Warsaw Ghetto. I saw the first photographs of the Holocaust, thus understanding the meaning before knowing the word. I realized what we were liberated from. In my country today, there are people who are wondering if the resistance had a real military impact on the course of the war. For my generation, this question is irrelevant. We immediately understood the moral and psychological meaning of the resistance. For us, it was a point of pride to know that we Europeans did not wait passively for liberation. And for the young Americans who are paying with their blood for our restored freedom, it meant something to know that behind the firing lines, there were Europeans paying their own debt in advance. In my country today, there are those who are saying that the myth of the resistance was a communist lie. It is true that communists exploited the resistance as if it were their personal property, since they played a prime role in it, but I remember partisans with kerchiefs of different colors. Sticking close to the radio, I spent my nights, the windows closed, the blackout making small space around the set of a lone luminous halo, listening to the messages sent by the Voice of London to the partisans. They were cryptic and poetic at the same time. The sun also rises, the roses will bloom. And most of them were Messages per la Franchise. Somebody whispered to me that Franchi was the leader of the most powerful clandestine network in northwest Italy, a man of legendary courage. Franchi became my hero. Franchi, whose real name was Edgardo Sogno, was a monarchist, so strongly anti-communist that after the war he joined very right-wing groups and was charged with collaborating in a project for a reactionary coup d'etat. Who cares? Sogno still remains the dream hero of my childhood. Liberation was a common deed for people of different colors. In my country today, there are some who say the War of Liberation was a tragic period of division, that all we need is national reconciliation. The memory of those terrible years should be repressed. Refouler verdragant. I don't know what these words mean. I'm so sorry. But Verdrangung causes neurosis. If reconciliation means compassion and respect for all those who fought their own war in good faith, to forgive does not mean to forget. I can even admit that Eichmann sincerely believed in his mission, but I cannot say, okay, come back and do it again. We are here to remember what happened and solemnly say that they must not do it again. But who are they? If we think of the totalitarian governments that ruled Europe before the Second World War, we can easily say that it would be difficult for them to reappear in the same form in different historical circumstances. If Mussolini's fascism was based upon the idea of a charismatic ruler, on corporatism, on the utopia of the imperial fate of Rome, on an imperialistic will to conquer new territories, on an exacerbated nationalism, on the idea of an entire nation regimented in black shirts, on the rejection of parliamentary democracy, on anti-Semitism, then I have no difficulty in acknowledging that today the Italian Alleanza Nazionale, born from the post-war fascist party MSI, and certainly a right-wing party, has by now very little to do with the old fascism. In the same vein, even though I am much concerned about the various Nazi-like movements that have arisen here and there in Europe, including Russia, I do not think that Nazism, in its original form, is about to reappear as a nationwide movement. Nevertheless, even though political regimes can be overthrown and ideologies can be criticized and disowned, behind the regime and its ideology, there is always a way of thinking and feeling, a group of cultural habits, of obscure instincts and unfathomable drives. Is there still another ghost stalking Europe? Not to speak of other parts of the world. Yonseko once said that only words count and the rest is mere chattering. Linguistic habits are frequently important systems of underlying feelings. Thus, it is worth asking why not only the resistance but the Second World War was generally defined throughout the world as a struggle against fascism. If you reread Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, you will discover that Robert Jordan identifies his enemies with fascists, even when he thinks of the Spanish phalangists. And for FDR, the victory of the American people and their allies will be a victory against fascism and the dead hand of despotism it represents. During World War II, the Americans who took part in the Spanish War were called premature anti-fascists, meaning that fighting against Hitler in the 40s was a moral duty for every good American, but fighting against Franco too early in the 30s smelled sour because it was mainly done by communists and other leftists. Why was an expression like fascist pig used by American radicals 30 years later to refer to a cop who did not approve of their smoking habits? Why didn't they say Kagulard pig, phalangist pig, Ustache pig, Quisling pig, Nazi pig? Mein Kampf is a manifesto of a complete political program. Nazism had a theory of racism and of the Aryan chosen people, a precise notion of degenerate art, entartet Kunst, a philosophy of the will to power and of the Übermensch. Nazism was decidedly anti-Christian and neo-pagan, while Stalin's Diamat, the official version of Soviet Marxism, was blatantly materialistic and atheistic. If by totalitarianism one means a regime that subordinates every act of the individual to the state and to its ideology, then both Nazism and Stalinism were true totalitarian regimes. Italian fascism was certainly a dictatorship, but it was not totally totalitarian, not because of its mildness, but rather because of the philosophical weakness of its ideology. Contrary to common opinion, fascism in Italy had no special philosophy. The article on fascism signed by Mussolini in the Treccani Encyclopedia was written or basically inspired by Giovanni Gentile, but it reflected the late Hegelian notion of the absolute and ethical state, which was never fully realized by Mussolini. Mussolini did not have any philosophy. He only had rhetoric. He was a militant atheist at the beginning and later signed the convention with the church and welcomed the bishops who blessed the fascist penance. In his early anti-clerical years, according to a likely legend, he once asked God, in order to prove his existence, to strike him down on the spot. Later, Mussolini always cited the name of God in his speeches and did not mind being called the Man of Providence. Italian fascism was the first right-wing dictatorship that took over a European country, and all similar movements later found a sort of archetype in Mussolini's regime. Italian fascism was the first to establish a military liturgy, a folklore, even a way of dressing, far more influential with its black shirts than Armani, Benetton, or Versace would ever be. It was only in the 30s that fascist movements appeared, with Mosley in Great Britain and in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Yugoslavia, Spain, Portugal, Norway, and even in South America. It was Italian fascism that convinced many European leaders that the new regime was carrying out interesting social reform, and that it was providing a mildly revolutionary alternative to the communist threat. Nevertheless, historical priority does not seem to me a sufficient reason to explain why the word fascism became a synecdoche. That is, a word that could be used for different totalitarian movements. This is not because fascism contained itself, so to speak, in their quintessential state, all the elements of any later form of totalitarianism. On the contrary, fascism had no quintessence. Fascism was a fuzzy totalitarianism, a collage of different philosophical and political ideas, a beehive of contradictions. Can one conceive of a truly totalitarian movement that was able to combine monarchy with revolution, the royal army with Mussolini's personal militia, the grant of privileges to the church with state education extolling violence, absolute state control with a free market, The Fascist Party was born boasting that it brought a revolutionary new order, but it was financed by the most conservative among the landowners, who expected from it a counter-revolution. At its beginning, fascism was republican, yet it survived for 20 years, proclaiming its loyalty to the royal family, while the Deuce, the unchallenged maximal leader, was arm in arm with the king, to whom he offered the title of emperor. But when the king fired Mussolini in 1943, the party reappeared 2 months later with German support, under the standard of a social republic, recycling its old revolutionary script, now enriched with almost Jacobean overtones. It's pointless to correct my pronunciation, guys. There was only a single Nazi architecture and a single Nazi art. If the Nazi architect was Albert Speer, there was no more room for Miles van der Rohe. Similarly, under Stalin's rule, if Lamarck was right, there was no room for Darwin. In Italy, there were certainly fascist architects, but close to their pseudo-colosseums were many new buildings inspired by modern rationalisms of Gropius. There was no fascist Zdanov setting a strictly cultural line. In Italy, there were two important art awards. The Premio Cremona was controlled by a fanatical and uncultivated fascist, Roberto Farinacci, who encouraged art as propaganda. I can remember paintings with such titles as Listening by Radio to the Douche's Speech, or States of Mind created by fascism. The Premio Bergamo was sponsored by the cultivated and reasonably tolerant fascist Giuseppe Bottai, who protected both the concept of art for art's sake and many kinds of avant-garde art that had been banned as corrupt and crypto-communist in Germany. The national poet was D'Annunzio. I really do apologize for my pronunciation. I'm doing the best I can. This is a lot easier when you just read it with your eyeballs and don't have to say it out loud, okay? A dandy who in Germany or in Russia would have been sent to the firing squad. He was appointed as the bard of the regime because of his nationalism and his cult of heroism, which were in fact abundantly mixed up with influences of French fin de siècle decadence. I'm doing the best I can. Douche. There you go. There, I did it. Take futurism. One might think it would have been considered an instance of Entartete Kunst, along with Expressionism, Cubism, and Surrealism. But early Italian futurists were nationalist. They favored Italian participation in the First World War for aesthetic reasons. They celebrated speed, violence, and risk, all of which somehow seemed to connect with the fascist cult of youth. While fascism identified itself with the Roman Empire and rediscovered rural traditions, Marinetti, who proclaimed that a car was more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace and wanted to kill even the moonlight, was nevertheless appointed as a member of the Italian Academy, which treated moonlight with great respect. Many of the future partisans and the future intellectuals of the Communist Party were educated by the GUF, the Fascist University Students' Association, which was supposed to be the cradle of the new fascist culture. These clubs became a sort of intellectual melting pot where new ideas circulated without any real ideological control. It was not that the men of the party were tolerant of radical thinking, but few of them had the intellectual equipment to control it. During those 20 years, the poetry of Montale and other writers associated with the group called the Ermetici, I'll go with, as a reaction to the bombastic style of the regime, and those poets were allowed to develop their literary protest from within what seemed to be their ivory tower. The mood of the Ermetici, I'm bad at Italian, poets was exactly the reverse of the fascist cult of optimism and heroism. The regime tolerated their blatant, even though socially imperceptible, dissent, because the fascists simply did not pay attention to such arcane language. All this does not mean that Italian fascism was tolerant. Gramsci was put in prison until his death. The opposition leaders Giacomo Matteotti and the brothers Rosselli were assassinated. The free press was abolished. The labor unions were dismantled. The political dissenters were confined on remote islands. Legislative power became a mere fiction, and the executive power, which controlled the judiciary as well as the mass media, directly issued new laws. I wonder where we've heard of similar plans in America. Among them, laws calling for preservation of the race, the formal Italian gesture of support for what became the Holocaust. The contradictory picture I described was not the result of tolerance, but of political and ideological discombobulation. But it was a rigid discombobulation, a structured confusion. Fascism was philosophically out of joint, but emotionally it was firmly fastened to some archetypal foundations. So we come to my second point. There was only one Nazism. We cannot label Franco's hyper-Catholic phalangism as Nazism, since Nazism is fundamentally pagan, polytheistic, and anti-Christian. But the fascist regime can be played in many forms, and the name of the game does not change. The notion of fascism is not unlike Wittgenstein's notion of a game. A game can be either competitive or not. It can require some special skill or none. It can or cannot involve money. Games are different activities that display only some family resemblance, as Wittgenstein put it. Considering the following sequence: 1, 2, 3, 4. ABC, BCD, CDE, DEF. Suppose there is a series of political groups in which one group is characterized by the features ABC, group 2 by the features BCD, and so on. Group 2 is similar to group 1 since they have two features in common. For the same reason, 3 is similar to 2 and 4 is similar to 3. Notice that 3 is also similar to 1. They have in common the feature C. The most common case is presented by 4, obviously similar to 3 and 2, but with no feature in common with 1. However, owing to the uninterrupted series of decreasing similarities between 1 and 4, there remains, by a sort of illusory transitivity, a family resemblance between 4 and 1. Fascism became an all-purpose term because one can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features and it will still be recognizable as fascist. Take away imperialism from fascism, you still have Franco and Salazar. Take away colonialism and you still have the Balkan fascism of the Ustaches. Add to the Italian fascism a radical anti-capitalism, which never much fascinated Mussolini, and you have Ezra Pound. Add a cult of Celtic mythology and the Grail mysticism, completely alien to official fascism, and you have one of the most respected fascist gurus, Julius Evola. But in spite of this fuzziness, I think it's possible to outline a list of features that are typical of what I like to call Ur-Fascism, or eternal fascism. These features cannot be organized into a system. Many of them contradict each other, and are also typical of other kinds of despotism or fanaticism, but it is enough that one of them be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. And that brings us, chat, to the 14 points of fascism, okay? So all of what has led up to this in Ur-Fascism, we're taking a little intermission here, is essentially laying the groundwork for what Umberto Eco personally experienced, how he got to kind of this definition, how he came to an awareness of different kinds and manifestations of fascism, and what he is talking about when he wants to talk about how fascism is this kind of slippery ideology and manifests in these different kinds of ways. And I know that fascism has there are a lot of people who've undertaken a definition of fascism. You can find more contemporary ones. This one's old. Maybe you'd consider it outdated. But ultimately, I think that Umberto Eco captures a pretty important component of what makes fascism fascism, and it is this slippery nature. It's why I think 14 points or components of fascism make for a compelling definition. And the reason a lot of people take issue with this is because you can find elements of these 14 points in a lot of different countries or political movements. But those might not technically be fascist, you know? Because when you're talking about this, and I think it's important to point out that last sentence, but it is enough that one of these features be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it, which is to say that one of these features is not necessarily sufficient to call a government or a political movement fascist, but one of these features being present can be the catalyst of fascism's growth, can be the element around which fascists congregate in order to achieve a movement that then incorporates more of these points. Yeah, it's the start. It can be the start of the rot, I think is a good way of putting it. Fascist here. I found Umberto Eco's works to be an awful explanation of fascism. That's fine. If you're fascist, I don't really care about your opinion on the matter. I've talked to enough fascists in the course of doing my show that you guys twist yourselves into pretzels. It's pointless talking with you guys. You guys have no ideological core to you. You'll list off like Giovanni Gentile's point, and then immediately abandon it the second it ceases to be convenient for you.
Carabinieri is pronounced like carabiner with the E-er, like hair, E ending. They're the Italian military police. Carabinieri.
Carabinieri, gotcha. I mean, I'll do my best to keep up with how to pronounce Italian, but I fully acknowledge my failure in this regard, okay? I fully acknowledge it. Oh, God. Let's see here. Gotta find my place. But this is where we start getting into the 14 points. So what actually is Umberto trying to allege that fascism is? If he nails it down to just 14 component parts, what is fascism? Okay? And this is, by the way, why I take issue with how Anna tried to define fascism. Because as far as I can tell, she's just like fabricating it without any kind of like philosophical base or it seems like she's just kind of pulling it out of thin air, which is not great when you're trying to talk about a defined political movement. But let's take a look. Let's take a look at Umberto Eco here. Okay? Point 1. The first feature of Ur-Fascism is the cult of tradition. Traditionalism is, of course, much older than fascism. Not only was it typical of counter-revolutionary Catholic thought after the French Revolution, but it was born in the late Hellenistic era, as a reaction to classical Greek rationalism. In the Mediterranean basin, people of different religions, most of them indulgently accepted by the Roman pantheon, started dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of human history. This revelation, according to the traditionalist mystique, had remained for a long time concealed under the veil of forgotten languages, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in Celtic runes, in the scrolls of the little-known religions of Asia. This new culture had to be syncretistic. Syncretism is not only, as the dictionary says, the combination of different forms of belief or practice, such a combination must tolerate contradictions. Each of the original messages contains a sliver of wisdom, and whenever they seem to say different or incompatible things, it is only because all are alluding allegorically to the same primeval truth. As a consequence, there can be no advancement in learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. One only has to look at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi gnosis was nourished by traditionalist syncretistic occult elements. the most influential theoretical source of the theories of the new Italian right, Julius Evola, merged the Holy Grail with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, alchemy with the Holy Roman Empire, and Germanic Empire. The very fact that the Italian right, in order to show its open-mindedness, recently broadened its syllabus to include works by De Maistre, Guénon, and Gramsci is a blatant proof of syncretism. If you browse in the shelves in American bookstores that in American bookstores are labeled as New Age, you can find there even St. Augustine, who, as far as I know, was not a fascist. But combining St. Augustine and Stonehenge, that is a symptom of Ur-Fascism. And I think that's a really interesting point here, because I think this is, when I talk about there being this conspiracy singularity, you know, where the hippy-dippy woo science and like brain force plus pills and conspiracy nonsense like all begin to blend. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I mean. People start bringing in these different contradictory ideas and melding them together into unholy abominations that don't make sense, that are fundamentally incompatible. And so you get this this movement that is built around, you know, discovering these obscure truths. And I say truths with air quotes here. And then you build essentially a customized religion for your political movement. Like that's kind of what we're talking about here. That also explains why a lot of hippies turned into fash in their old years. Exactly, Grandsome. Exactly. You're getting it. Also, Brutus Magnuson, thank you for the $5 super chat. Fascism is older than fascism. It's large-scaled chimp mode obsessed within groups, safety, a strong man, aesthetics, and emotions. It's baked in. I don't think that is quite it. I don't think that's quite it. I think you're mentioning a lot of components of fascism, but I think fascism is pretty distinct compared to like feudalism, for example, or even authoritarian monarchy, where I think fascism is a slipperier thing than those. You can have cruel monarchs and it still not be a fascist regime. Does that make sense? All right. Moving on. Point 2. Traditionalism implies the rejection of modernism. Both fascists and Nazis worshipped technology, while traditionalist thinkers usually reject it as a negation of traditional spiritual values. However, even though Nazism was proud of its industrial achievements, its praise of modernism was only the surface of an ideology based upon blood and earth. Or blood and soil, as we hear in America these days. The rejection of the modern world was disguised as a rebuttal of the capitalistic way of life, but it mainly concerned the rejection of the spirit of 1789 and of 1776, of course. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, Ur-Fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Okay? Because as a component, irrationalism is almost required for that first point. You know? That first point talks about combining ideas that are contradictory. And the second point involves embracing contradiction, embracing a lack of rationality, a lack of logic, a lack of empiricism, you know? Not exactly Vox Syndicate. Not making sense is the point, because by not making sense, you can strengthen the regime. You can strengthen the ideology. It makes it much harder to question and find actual real answers. And I think I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I think we also see this in the current Trump movement. It's baked in. It's part of the fake news. It's part of the alternative facts. It is the deliberate rejection of factual reporting. Point number 3. Irrationalism also depends on the cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken, therefore, or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. Therefore, culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. Distrust of the intellectual world has always been a symptom of Ur-Fascism. From Göring's alleged statement, quote, "When I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun," unquote, to the frequent use of such expressions as, quote, "degenerate intellectuals," or eggheads, or effete snobs. Universities are a nest of Reds. The official fascist intellectuals were mainly engaged in attacking modern culture and the liberal intelligentsia for having betrayed traditional values. When we talk about, when we talk about here how intellectualism and it is effeminate, we're making a direct connection here between fascism and masculinity, because in a lot of ways, men who are feeling alienated by the current state of affairs are drawn to fascism. They are drawn to this because it puts up on a pedestal not having introspection, not embracing rationality, and it promotes heroism of people who just do things and are praised for it. It's essentially like reading is gay. Being smart is, like a symptom of degeneracy. There's this association between homosexuality or transgender identity and, well, science, for example. There's a reason why transphobic movements that are embedded in these fascistic ones fit this to a T, and it's because fascists reject scientific achievement. They reject empiricist ideas. And so by having a political movement that embraces that bigotry, you can effectively root out anyone who might actually criticize the movement from within and suppress them from without. So you effectively lock down your movement, okay? It's part of, this combination of these 3 points alone so far is enough to explain why fascists are really, really hard to logically argue out of their positions, because logic is not part of their, worldview. It is explicitly rejected. Okay? Point 4. No syncretistic faith can withstand analytical criticism. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. For Ur-Fascism, disagreement is treason.
Syncretism is big with a lot of modern polytheists. Should they be concerned?
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. This isn't universally true, but often religious thinking is founded on, to my mind, irrational, leaping to conclusions. There's not really a rational one-to-one way of thinking your way to a lot of religious beliefs. I think that, and keep in mind, that doesn't mean it's always bad. But it does mean that this opens the door to fascists taking advantage of that religious belief. You know? Like that's part of the problem. That's why you need to be on your guard for fascists in your religious movements. Like there's a reason why the entire evangelical apparatus of belief in the United States has been completely co-opted by fascists, by Christian nationalists. It's because that door is open. There's a reason why New Age communities have been inundated by fascist, conspiracy theorists. That, like, it's because the door is opened to these kinds of people. So you need to be on your guard. Syncretism is just another way of thinking. Religion is an institution. Syncretic religion is just another religion. Yeah, and I think that religious belief opens the door to this particular outcome. That's why I'm saying you need to be on guard. I know that might be a little controversial, but like, I have to call a spade. And as someone who grew up in the evangelical community that's currently being radicalized into a fascist movement, I gotta say, sometimes people don't really pay attention to a bunch of fascists getting involved in their religious beliefs. The Crystal Mommy to MAGA crazy pipeline is real? Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm not saying every religious person is a fascist. I'm just saying this particular contradiction is what opens the door for religious movements to be co-opted by fascism. I hope that makes sense. I don't think what I'm saying is particularly controversial. Okay?
Trump. What's with this you keep putting before fascism? I looked it up and it was a Mesopotamian city-state. We are not Mesopotamian, we're American.
God, I would love Trump to read over and respond to Ur-Fascism. That'd be the trippiest thing. That would be some content, baby. Syncretism is a phenomenon within religion wherein new elements of culture are adopted. Do you not see how that is directly related to opening the door of your ideology or religious belief being co-opted? Okay, I need to stop engaging on this particular point. Otherwise, I'm going to get completely sidetracked. The main point I'm trying to get at here. Is that science is quite literally built upon a foundation of failure. You know, science is ultimately like a Dark Souls game. Okay, or Elden Ring. You die, you fail, and then you figure something out.
Anti-vax woo-woo Crystal Mommy to fascism arc is as real as the denial beard conservative, libertarian to leftist trans woman arc.
True. Gamerg, thank you for the $5 dono. But what I'm trying to say here is, like, science is built on failure, on experiments that fail, on the failure of different hypotheses, of different theories, but it's exciting when a theory fails because that means there's a whole new thing to discover out there. It's really cool when theories break down in science. But when we're talking about this particular fascist belief, that critical analysis that science is predicated on is seen as specifically anathema to the, state ideology, to fascism itself. Because disagreement, criticism is treason to the state, to the political ideology. And where do you see that in Donald Trump's movement right now? You see it at literally every level. If someone disagrees with Donald Trump, they are excommunicated.
This is part of why I stay agnostic and eclectic unaffiliated. It's just about appreciating nature to me.
Thank you for the $5 dono. I appreciate that. Yeah. This is why fascists get very, very angry at disagreement in their ranks. Point 5. Besides, disagreement is a sign of diversity. Ur-Fascism grows up and seeks for consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, Ur-Fascism is racist by definition. And guys, that's literally the MAGA movement. That's the main premise right now. The fascination and focus on immigration happened in 2016. The caravan. And suddenly it disappeared. Like, the concerns about the caravan totally vanished. And now it's, they're flooding the borders. They're invading the country. But, like, they're coming here to perform labor, to add to our economy. They're coming here to do work for us. Brutus Magnuson, thank you for the $2 super chat. Yeah, rhino is another term right there. This fear is extended to trans people, to homosexuals, to anyone outside of the norm, you know? And the second it becomes convenient to do so, groups like Gays Against Groomers or whatever are going to be next on the chopping block because they are outside of heteronormativity. Like they're outside of like the mainstream conception of what is normal. And what is normal can change on a dime depending on who's in power. Even people with autism? Yeah. Because eventually, like, fascist movements also want to remove anyone who thinks differently from the movement. And who thinks differently in the movement more than people who have mental neurological conditions? Yeah, especially people with autism. Because you know what? People with autism, they're going to be like, why can't I criticize the government? That's stupid. I should be able to criticize a social institution. And then you get disappeared. That's how that works in fascism. Okay? So, fascism is also built on a fundamental rejection of diversity. And what do you hear from all of the people in Trump world? America is for Americans. People from outside need to get out. And you know what? What we saw at the Madison Square Garden rally? We saw that who is and is not considered American is very, very flexible. Because in that rally, they made it pretty clear they don't consider Puerto Ricans to be Americans. Okay? Point 6. Ur-Fascism derives from individual or social frustration. That is why one of the most typical features of the historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class. A class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. In our time, when the old proletarians are becoming petty bourgeois and the lumpen are largely excluded from the political scene, the fascism of tomorrow will find its audience in this new majority. And honestly, it's kind of crazy that Umberto Eco was able to write this in 1995, and it fits so perfectly on the fascist movement in America today. Because the people who are largely fueling Trump's rise to power are those small business owners who, you know, run the snowmobile dealership outside of town and live in the suburbs. And that snowmobile dealership makes them, you know, $10 million a year. Okay? Those are the people who are feeling like they're being hit by the economy right now. They're the ones who are the frustrated middle class in America. You know? At least that's how they see themselves. Okay? Like, the people who did January 6th were all, like, suburban conservatives. You guys know that, right? Like, they're able to afford, like, semi-automatic weapons. They're able to afford plane tickets and to drop work for a week to go to Washington, D.C. for this. You know, like, that's who his base is. And you know what? It's largely born out of their political humiliation because they believe that they have been humiliated by the liberal, elites of America, that they have been the butt of the joke one too many times. And that's why ultimately all they care about is owning the libs. It all comes out of this petty desire for revenge. And because they feel, like their power is slipping away due to trans people are becoming normalized. Gay people are becoming normalized. There are more and more, non-white people in the country. That's why you see this idea of the great replacement theory gaining steam. It's because the people they view as lesser are becoming more normalized, and that makes them feel like their power is dwindling and that they are under threat as a result. Yeah, also, for those who don't know, avoid using the term Asperger's. It is funny to say because it sounds like Asperger's, but it was coined by Nazis, so let's maybe not. Are we watching the rally today? Yes, but you know what? We're going to talk about fascism first because I want you all armed with an actual functional understanding of what fascism is. Might not be the best one. People can nitpick it for sure, but it is one of the standard methods of identifying what fascism is. Now, point 7. To people who feel deprived of a clear social identity, Ur-Fascism says that their only privilege is the most common one, to be born in the same country. This is the origin of nationalism. Besides, the only ones who can provide an identity to the nation are its enemies. Thus, at the root of the Ur-Fascist psychology, there is the obsession with a plot, possibly an international one. The followers must feel besieged. The easiest way to solve the plot is to appeal to xenophobia. But the plot must also come from the inside. Jews are usually the best target because they have the advantage of being at the same time inside and outside. In the US, a prominent insistence of the plot obsession is to be found in Pat Robertson's The New World Order. But as we have seen recently, there are many others. Keep in mind, in 1995, Pat Robertson was much bigger than he is now. And also keep in mind that, the Trump camp is absolutely obsessed. It plots from the deep state, plots from, the Kamala Harris administration, plots from the CIA, plots from the FBI, plots from QAnon folks believing the Jews are behind, the resurgence of RFK Jr., they're George Soros, New World Order, there are so many different plots. This is why I talk about the conspiracy singularity. It's because it's the obsession of a plot with these people, because they always need a scapegoat. The globalists, Klaus Schwab, you will eat the bugs. So, that's to say, this has become so incredibly prominent that there are almost too many conspiracies to even begin to name that many Trump supporters believe. I mean, hell, one of the most popular ones is that America faked the moon landing, and there's literally no basis for that whatsoever. There's no basis to believe that we faked the moon landing. You see this from basically every conservative influencer, by the way. Almost every single one pushes some kind of conservative conspiracy theory. For Ur-Fascism, Wait. Okay. Here we go. Point 8. The followers must feel humiliated by the ostentatious wealth and force of their enemies. When I was a boy, I was taught to think of Englishmen as the 5-meal people. They ate more frequently than the poor but sober Italians. Jews are rich and help each other through a secret web of mutual assistance. However, the followers must be convinced that they can overwhelm the enemies. Thus, by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. And you can see this, by the way, like the obsession, like immigrants are simultaneously like, a gigantic crime threat. They're an invading force, but simultaneously like they're to be mocked. Even people tangentially related to them are to be called people from a garbage island. And yeah, you can see this in Russia. You can see this in Israel. Like, you can see this particular portion of ideology, this point 8 here, manifest in a lot of countries around the world. But you can see this, by the way, reflected in all kinds of Republican rhetoric. Liberals are both weak and effeminate, but they are also overwhelmingly strong and run all of the United States institutions. It's both. Yeah, Kamala Harris, simultaneously mentally incompetent and also a socialist mastermind of the revolution. Exactly. They do this with trans people a lot. Yeah, trans people, I think, is a perfect example, Krista Starr. Like, trans women are both simultaneously the strongest athletes to ever exist and also effeminate men who are too weak to cut it as cis men, Absolutely. Absolutely. Point 9. For Ur-Fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather, life is lived for struggle. Thus, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. It is bad because life is permanent warfare. This, however, brings about an Armageddon complex, or to put it in like a more normal parlance, a death cult mentality. Since enemies have to be defeated, there must be a final battle, after which the movement will have control of the world. But such a final solution implies an era of peace, a golden age, which contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has ever succeeded in solving this predicament. And this is fundamentally like what we're talking about. We're talking about effectively choosing peace is trafficking with the enemy. Choosing peace is treason. Choosing to embrace like peace and negotiations is in effect a betrayal of the movement. And where can we see that? Well, Donald Trump, actually. Donald Trump simultaneously touts himself as like an anti-war president, someone who is totally against war. And yet simultaneously behind closed doors, he's talking about nuking North Korea and Iran. He's talking about and ordering assassinations of prominent military leaders in countries around the world. He's screwing over allies of ours with military maneuvers. And on top of that, like, he's supporting genocidal efforts of our allies, Like, he's gone on the record now saying that he is going to, like, double down, triple down support for Israel in its efforts to, ethnically cleanse and perpetrate a genocide in the Gaza Strip. He already gave them the Golan Heights, which was not Israeli territory until he was president. And he's very publicly pledged to give Israel the West Bank. Like, this is not a guy who is embracing pacifism. This is not a movement that values peace. Point 10. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology, insofar as it is a fundamentally aristocratic and militaristic elitism cruelly implies contempt for the weak. Ur-Fascism can only advocate a popular elitism. Every citizen belongs to the best people of the world. The members of the party are the best among the citizens. Every citizen can or ought to become a member of the party, but there cannot be patricians without plebeians. In fact, the leader, knowing that his power was not delegated to him democratically, but was conquered by force, also knows that his force is based upon the weakness of the masses. They are so weak as to need and deserve a ruler. A dictator on day one, perhaps. Since the group is hierarchically organized according to a military model, every subordinate leader despises his own underlings, and each of them despises his inferiors. This reinforces the sense of mass elitism. So part of what this is talking about here is this is like a reward system. This is how fascism kind of perpetuates itself and appeals to the working class, or the plebeians in this case, because it sets up an incentive to join the party. And by joining the party, you immediately place yourself above those who have not joined the party. And by moving up the ranks of the party, you gain more and more people to feel superior towards. So it's a system that is built on hatred for people that you perceive as weaker than you. This is an inherently conservative ideology. Yes, it is essentially a form of class mobility within fascism, but you are always under the boot of someone else who also despises you. Yes, sweet blasphemy. That is a great way of describing it. It is a multi-level marketing scheme that sells people hatred. That's a great way of putting it. Great way of putting it. And yes, you can see this manifest in a lot of forms of colonialism, which is why colonial states are uniquely susceptible, I think, to fascist ideology. But we'll get to that. 11. In such a perspective, everybody is educated to become a hero. In every mythology, the hero is an exceptional being. But in Ur-Fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. It is not by chance that a motto of the Phalangists was Viva la Muerte. In English, it should be translated as Long Live Death. In non-fascist societies, the lay public is told that death is unpleasant, but must be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is a painful way to reach a supernatural happiness. By contrast, the Ur-Fascist hero craves heroic death, advertised as the best reward for a heroic life. The Ur-Fascist hero is impatient to die. In his impatience, he more frequently sends other people to death. This is the fascist mentality. This is why fascists speed up death for people in their ideology, in their ideological sphere. This is one of the reasons why they embraced anti-vax notions. It's because it's a death cult. When we talk about it being a death cult, this is the mechanism. When we talk about fascism being a death cult, this is what that means. Yes. In Delta Who, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. There you go. Point 12. Since both permanent war and heroism are difficult games to play, the Ur-Fascist transfers his power to sexual matters. Now, remember how earlier we talked about how a lot of this is built on an idea of masculinity? Here it is explicitly laid out in point 12. This is the origin of machismo, which implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. This is why when we talk about incels being a self-hating group that lend themselves to conservative ideology, it's because they believe in the concept of machismo. They just believe themselves to be, like, not living up to that standard. You know, they hate themselves for their, you know, involuntary chastity, you know? And this is why this proliferation of red pill content largely goes hand in hand with extraordinarily conservative ideas, because it is a disdain for women that fuels it. It is the treatment of women and sex with them as a commodity in the red pill mentality. And not only that, but this is why fascism hates trans people. It's why fascism hates gay people. It's because they're bucking the norms. You know, with the idea of machismo, as Umberto Eco is outlining here, he's talking about, you know, if you're gay, wait a minute, you're supposed to be having sex with women. That's what you are supposed to do, both like on a religious level, on a societal level, and on a political level. You are required, in order to fuel the death cult, to create more people for the death cult. And this is also an extension of hierarchy. By disdaining women, by embracing machismo, even people who have not joined the political movement can then, you know, have hatred. And by people, I mean men who have not joined the political movement can hate their inferiors. Women, gays, trans people. But these chads don't even like women. That's part of it. That's part of it, Brianna Huffman. They disdain women. They hate women. That's part of this toxic fascist machismo. Okay? They only view women as a means to get sex. They don't view women as people. This is what allows them to hate and view women as inferiors. It's a component of the ideology. It is actually the purpose of the ideology. Sounds kind of gay, but that it is. That's why you find in fascist movements so many, like, fascists idealizing femboys. It's why you find that to be so incredibly common in fascist movements. All right. Since even sex is a difficult game to play, the Ur-Fascist hero tends to play with weapons. Doing so becomes an ersatz phallic exercise. So we didn't get to that last point on point 12, which is that men who are sexually frustrated are then encouraged via machismo as a component ideology of fascism, or ideological component of fascism, to embrace weaponry, which then plays into that death cult mentality, which plays into that constant warfare component. You see how a lot of these are interconnected. We're in the home stretch now. Point 13. Ur-Fascism is based upon a selective populism, a qualitative populism, one might say. In democracy, the citizens have individual rights, but the citizens in their entirety have a political impact only from a quantitative point of view. One follows the decisions of the majority. For Ur-Fascism, however, individuals as individuals have no rights, and the people is conceived as a quality, a monolithic entity expressing the common will. Since no large quantity of human beings can have a common will, the leader pretends to be their interpreter. Having lost their power of delegation, citizens do not act. They are only called on to play the role of the people. Thus, the people is only a theatrical fiction. To have a good instance of qualitative populism, we no longer need the Piazza Venezia in Rome or the Nuremberg Stadium. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. Because of its qualitative populism, Ur-Fascism must be against rotten parliamentary governments. One of the first sentences uttered by Mussolini in the Italian parliament was, quote, "I could have transformed this deaf and gloomy place into a bivouac for my maniples." Maniples being a subdivision of the traditional Roman legion. As a matter of fact, he immediately found better housing for his maniples, but a little later, he liquidated the parliament. Wherever a politician casts doubt on the legitimacy of a parliament because it no longer represents the voice of the people, we can smell Ur-Fascism. And guess what? Guess who's casting aspersions on the legitimacy of our political process right now? And for like the last 10 years. Donald Trump. It's Trumpism. This is just Trumpism. Yeah, when we're talking about the voice of the people, the silent majority, you know, like, oh, everyone else in the room agrees with it, you know, like we're basically talking about a religious fiction where the great leader, the dictator, claims to understand the ineffable will of the people better than any other leader can. And now we get to the last point. Ur-Fascism speaks newspeak. Newspeak was invented by Orwell in 1984 as the official language of Ingsoc, English socialism. But elements of Ur-Fascism are common to different forms of dictatorship. All the Nazi or fascist schoolbooks made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. But we must be ready to identify other kinds of newspeak, even if they take the apparently innocent form of a popular talk show. And just to pause there, alternative facts. Fake news. With those two phrases, you no longer, like, the conservatives no longer have to field arguments. They just say it's fake news and move on. We literally are seeing it play out in real time. Yeah, we watched a clip yesterday of Richard Spencer in 2016 directly connecting Donald Trump's words of fake news to the Nazi phrase Lügenpresse, lying press. What Hitler used to smear the left-wing press of Germany. Hello, Entrama. And now we get to the final stretch of the essay. We're almost done. On the morning of July 27th, 1943, I was told that, according to radio reports, fascism had collapsed and Mussolini was under arrest. When my mother sent me out to buy the newspaper, I saw that the papers at the nearest newsstand had different titles. Moreover, after seeing the headlines, I realized that each newspaper said different things. I bought one of them, blindly, and read a message on the first page signed by 5 or 6 political parties. Among them, the Democrazia Cristiana, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, Partido de Acción, and the Liberal Party. Until then, I had believed that there was a single party in every country, and that in Italy, it was the Partito Nazionale Fascista. Fascista? Now I was discovering that in my country, several parties could exist at the same time. Since I was a clever boy, I immediately realized that so many parties could not have been born overnight, and that they must have existed for some time as clandestine organizations. The message on the front celebrated the end of the dictatorship and the return of freedom. Freedom of speech, of press, of political association. These words, freedom, dictatorship, liberty, I now read them for the first time in my life. I was reborn as a free Western man by virtue of these new words. We must keep alert so that the sense of these words will not be forgotten again. Ur-Fascism is still around us, sometimes in plain clothes. It would be so much easier for us if there appeared on the world scene somebody saying, quote, I want to reopen Auschwitz. I want the black shirts to parade again in the Italian squares, unquote. Life is not that simple. Ur-Fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and to point our finger at any of its new instances, every day, in every part of the world. Franklin Roosevelt's words on November 4th, 1938 are worth recalling. I venture the challenging statement that if American democracy ceases to move forward as a living force, seeking day and night by peaceful means to better the lot of our citizens, fascism will grow in strength in our land. Freedom and liberation are an unending task. Let me finish with a poem by Franco Fortini. On the bridge's parapet, the heads of the hanged. In the flowing rivulet, the spittle of the hanged. On the cobbles in the marketplaces, the fingernails of those lined up and shot. On the dry grass in the open spaces, the broken teeth of those lined up and shot. Bitter in the air, biting the stones, biting the stones, our flesh is no longer human. Biting the air, biting the stones, our hearts are no longer human. But we have read into the eyes of the dead, and shall bring freedom on the earth, but clenched tight in the fists of the dead lies the justice to be served. And that, my friends, is the full entirety of Ur-Fascism. I just read it to you. You now have experienced it. And I know that a lot of you wouldn't have gone out and read it, so I thank you so much for sticking around and actually listening to me read that and, try and point out how it's incredibly applicable to our modern day. And so this is what frustrates me so much about Anna Kasparian, one of the most prominent, supposedly left-wing commentators in American media, not having a basis for defining fascism, not having a basis grounded in, some kind of coherent definition. And it's really frustrating because as that essay ends, we must constantly be vigilant every day in every part of the world. Freedom and liberation are an unending task. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it. And being lulled into sleep in this time of crisis, in this moment while we stand on the precipice of potentially capitulating the most powerful country to have ever existed on the planet into fascism, infuriates me to a degree I cannot conceive of.
Thanks for reading us the most uncozy bedtime story. Madge.
Two Dad Smoochin', thank you for the 2 tier 1 subs. I very much appreciate it. When would you say it ends? It doesn't end. The threat of fascism will always be manifest. I think largely it is part and parcel associated with the, adherence of capitalism. I think that for as long as capitalism and exploitation continues to exist, fascism will be a threat under which we must not be complacent. And I know that there are other academic terms or definitions of fascism, but I find this one particularly compelling. I find this one to be a decent overview of kind of that slipperiness of the fascist ideology, and I think that ultimately understanding Umberto Eco's definition of fascism can at the very least provide you with a basic understanding of what this is, of what this monster we're dealing with is. So you're saying if capitalism ends, so would the threat of fascism? That's something that I think. I don't know that to be a fact. I think that if we were to actually achieve like a true socialist vision of the world, we would constantly still have to make society better. There would constantly be improvements to be made in our systems. But it's possible that fascism would not really be tenable under a non-capitalist system. But it is also, as we have just talked about, a very slippery ideology that might very easily be able to mold itself to such a world. So I would never be willing to roll the dice on that one. Maintain vigilance. Always be on guard, because democracy is the most precious thing we have as a country, and we need to hold on to it. Because without democracy, we lose the mechanisms that allow us to make the country better in a peaceful way. Like without democracy, all we have is violence. All we have are violent levers to power. That's it. It is the only thing that keeps us in, out of just the ideology of the rock. The ideology of big rock. Yeah, no, real Radham, that does really seem to be it. Like, Anna's definition of fascism is really, well, he wasn't successful at fascism, so he's not a fascist. Yeah. Whew. That was a doozy.